एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। जैसा कि आपको पता है, हम प्रीवियस वीडियोस में प्रोलॉग टू द कैंटरबरी टेल्स की एक्सप्लेनेशन पढ़ चुके हैं। आज के वीडियो में हम क्वेश्चंस डिस्कस करेंगे रिलेटेड टू प्रोलॉग टू द कैंटरबरी टेल्स, और पहले की सारी वीडियोस के लिंक डिस्क्रिप्शन में है। चलिए डिस्कस करते हैं पहला क्वेश्चन। What are the salient features of Chaucer's art of characterization? Discuss with illustrations from the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, or comment on Chaucer's method of characterization, pointing out whether his characters, as depicted in the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales, are types or individuals, or discuss Chaucer's technique of characterization in the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. The character painting in the prologue has won wide acclaim. It has been said that of all the character writers in English literature, from Ben Jonson to Wordsworth, none is so great as Chaucer. I see all the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales, says Dryden, their humours, their features, and their very dress as distinctly as if I had supped with them at the Tabard in Southwark. He must have been a man of most wonderful, comprehensive nature, because he has taken into the compass of his Canterbury Tales the very manners and humours of the whole English nation in his age. Not a single character has escaped him. Chaucer's characterization of various persons in the prologue, says a critic, has a concentrated brilliance. Chaucer describes a man as if his eyes were wandering over him, noticing a detail and a detail there. He records his observation in a casual, haphazard manner. This impression of casualness and variety of detail indicate an art which conceals art. Chaucer does not follow any fixed pattern in describing the various characters. Sometimes certain items of dress are indicated first, and through these we see the character of the man. For instance, the knight's gibbon is still marked by the rust and oil from his armor. This is apparently mere factual information, yet from this we can judge that the knight has wasted no time after his return home to go on a pilgrimage. He is not keen about a smart outward appearance. Sometimes Chaucer describes a person's character and adds, almost as an afterthought, those details of dress which bring that person vividly before our eyes and reinforce what we already know of him. This is so in the cases of the lawyer, the physician, and the franklin, for example. In sketching the character of the pilgrims, Chaucer takes up the details that would strike the eye of a fellow traveller. There is a deliberately contrived disorder in the way in which the facts about each character are brought to our attention. For example, Chaucer describes the cook's skill in roasting, boiling, grilling, and frying, and then tells us that cook had a mormal on his skin and that he made black manager the best. The afterthought about Black Manager, an elaborate cream dish, gives an air of absolute naturalness to the description, and the air of innocent observation can be put to most effective ironic uses when Chaucer so desires. The author, as a fellow pilgrim, notes what he sees or learns about others in the casual order which occurs to him. He adds detail to detail, often in a non-logical order. In the prologue, Chaucer selected a large number of representatives of contemporary society. His selection of characters deserves consideration. In his time, the elegy were relatively far more numerous than they are today. The Oxford clerk, the summoner, the pardoner would, for example, be all in minor orders. Thus, there are as many as 8 representatives of the clergy, and excluding Chaucer himself, 19 laymen, 7 of whom are countrymen, 11 townsmen, and 1 a sailor. The countrymen range from the knight and the son, the squire, also representative of the courtly school of love, to the reeve and the ploughman. Of the town dwellers, there are 5 wealthy guildsmen, a merchant, a business woman, and 2 professional men, a lawyer and a doctor. 3 of the pilgrims are women, the prioress, her nun, and the wife of Bath, who is also something of a professional pilgrim, having visited a large number of shrines. Irony and satire are among the most striking features of Chaucer's characterization in the prologue. There is indeed a predominance of comic satire. Almost all the celestial characters, with the solitary exception of the parson, are objects of mockery and ridicule. The very dress and the fashionable manner of the prioress are ironically described. Her aristocratic pretensions are also ironically conveyed to us. Her vanities are fully exposed. In short, the ironic implication throughout the portrait of the prioress is that, in spite of her holy calling, she is more concerned with worldly things than with the spirit. In the case of the monk, Chaucer ironically refers to this violation of the rules of monastic discipline, his shirking both manual work and intellectual pursuits, his wearing a gold pin in the shape of a love knot, his appetite for a roasted fat swan, and so on. The friar had performed many marriages of young women at his own cost, a fact the implication of which is obvious. He is a noble pillar of his order, just as the monk is a friar prelate, the irony in each case being obvious. The friar great is also ironically conveyed, as is his dabbling in secular affairs such as settling disputes on love days. The lawyer seems busier than he actually is. The frontline's chief interest in life is eating choice dishes and drinking superior wines. The wives of the guildsmen are ambitious of heeding the ceremonial processions. The shipman is ironically called a good fellow, meaning a rascal. The doctor loved school, especially for gold, and medicine is a cordial. The municipal is always a gainer, whether he buys provision for cash or on credit. The reeve gives loan to his lord, the lord's own goods, and receives thanks in return, besides a coat and a hood as his reward. The summoner's impiety and the pardoner's fraudulent practices are also thoroughly exposed. Thus we find Chaucer unmasking the absurdities, the greed, the immorality, and the hypocrisy of various characters. Chaucer's use of the weapon of irony is indeed masterly. Not all the characters are treated ironically, however. The aristocracy represented by the knight is excluded from the scope of Chaucer's satire. The knight is almost idolized. He is a great warrior, he is wise, he values truth, honor, and generosity. The clerk of Oxford is another character represented in a most favorable light. He is studious, scholarly, unworldly, and frugal in his habits. Chaucer eulogizes him in the following words: and gladly world he learns and gladly teach. Other characters who receive nothing but praise are the parson and the plowman. The parson is poor in a worldly sense, but rich in holy thoughts and holy work. The plowman loves his fellow human being next only to God. Thus, Chaucer does not satirize those pilgrims who represent the medieval idol of three basic orders of society: knighthood, the clergy, in the person of the parson only, and the plowman. It has, however, to be admitted that the characterization of the good person is not as interesting as that of the bad ones. The good persons are more or less theories, not living or animated human beings. The bad ones are much more lively and much more vividly present. Chaucer wrote about people as he saw them. We never feel that he is describing puppets. Some of his characters were actually based on real people. Harry Bailey, innkeeper of Southwark, host of To the Pilgrims, actually existed and seems to have been a person well known in London. Some of the other pilgrims to have been identified as having actually lived. Many of the figures in the prologue seem almost to leap out of the page. There are two reasons for this. The first is that the descriptions follow no set order. Items appear to tumble out just as they come into the narrator's mind. The second is Chaucer's way of converting the portrait of a type into one of an individual typical of a class by adding distinctive personal traits. The wife of Bath's deafness, for instance, even brief portraits can include significant detail. The yeoman has his St. Christopher medallion, and the cook has his ulcer, just as the prioress, who is described at length, has her pet dogs. The effectiveness of these sketches is thus greatly enhanced. The sketches are not mere assemblages of general traits, composite photographs, types in the Theophrastic sense, but contain many individual details. Says one critic, it is by their successful blending of the individual with the typical that the portraits of Chaucer's prologue attain so high a degree of effectiveness. The wife of Bath is typical of certain primary instincts of women, but she is given local habitation beside Bath and is still further individualized by her partial deafness and the peculiar setting of her teeth. A wholly different type of womanhood, the conventional as opposed to the natural, is furnished by the prioress. The description of this gentle lady abounds in minute personal individual characteristics, physical and moral. Yet, all these individualizing traits are at the same time suggestive of that type which finds its fullest realization in the head of a young lady's school. What is true of these two is also true of all other personages of the prologue. The detail enumerated nearly always suggests at once the individual and the type. Furthermore, the sketches develop in a casual but not discursive manner. They are models of compression in expression and selection of significant details. So often the expression has an epigrammatic pointedness which is comparable to that of Alexander Pope. Finally, the success of these sketches is considerably due to variety in method and attitude. In the different characterizations, a sketch may be entirely general. For instance, the accounts of the yeoman, the physician, and the burgh. These are quite in the Fraustian manner. It may join realistic details to typical statements. For instance, the man of law, the franklin, the detail of the merchant, the cook, and the shipman, or it may join specific details to idealism. For instance, the sketch of the knight expresses the finest concept of chivalry, but joins to them the list of campaigns and details that he was not gay. It may be purely idle, the aim being to express in the highest degree the qualities desirable in a certain rank of life. For instance, the clerk, the plowman, the parson, it may represent an entirely individual character who at most is typical of a general class of human beings. For instance, the wife of Bath. It may contain satire to typical statements and possibly individual traits. For instance, the kindly satire of the squire and the prioress, the slightly more serious satire of the monk, the sharper satire of the rogue, especially the summoner and the partner and the friar. Any sketch may be lightened by humor. For instance, the square, the prioress, the manciple, and the man of law. Or it may be made more serious by a suggestion of moral disapproval, as in the case of friar. The summoner and the partner, indeed, the fact of variety in elements, methods is sharply to be challenged. In this connection, it is worthwhile quoting the following opinion. The portraits of the pilgrims are not all drawn in the same way. It is true that Chaucer endeavoured to picture individuals with an outstanding peculiarity, a physical trait like the miller's wart, a humour like the franklin's love of rich dishes, or a passion like the knight's love of prowess and truth, but the portraits differ in kind as well as in degree. Some of the portraits are idealized, other portraits are so realistic that they must have been drawn from life. Chaucer's success in the characterization is due to many factors. The range of classes which his pilgrims represent, the compression resulting from a high degree of selection of details and the pithiness of utterance, the use of individual details together with typical statements, and the varying ways in which he combined the elements in the different descriptions. Never before in English literature had there anything like this company of real and idealized contemporary men and women, and there was to be nothing comparable again until Shakespeare began to write 200 years later. अब second question discuss करते हैं. Chaucer's group of pilgrims constitute a picture of the society of his times. Discuss, or if you were writing a social history of the England in the 14th century, what help would you get from the prologue to the Canterbury Tales? Or Chaucer gives us a microcosm of English society in the prologue itself. Elucidate the statement, or Chaucer showed the world as it did exist, the England of his days, a world of reality, a world various and beautiful, but hitherto kept away from literature. Discuss, or a cross section of English life in the 14th century. Is this an adequate summing up of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales? The pilgrims in the prologue may be classified into three groups, which throw a lot of light on the social structure of England in the 14th century. The first group represents agricultural feudalism founded on land ownership and service to the king and the country. The knight, who is the highest in the scale is a landowner and has served in the wars for his king and his country, and he will be followed in this by his son, the square. The knight's yeoman is a servant whose only duty is to be the knight. The franklin also holds land, probably in fee from some nobleman, but more probably in his own right. His service in the is the supervision of his farm, his obligation to the nobleman or the king being doubtless in the form of the yearly harvest. The miller does not himself own land, but he enjoys the right to mill all the grain on an estate. The reeve functions as the manager of an estate. Both the miller and the reeve are subordinates but of superior kind, and they make a shrewd and profitable use of their power. The lowest in the hierarchy is the plowman, who simply tills the land. The second group represents the growth of a new urban society which had come into existence in the 14th century, mainly in London. Neither the doctor nor the lawyer owns land, although they are both men of substance. The doctor says Chaucer made money out of the plague, and the lawyer made money out of many transactions and bargains. They represent the beginning of a new class today called professional men. The manciple, the merchant, and even the wife of Bath, who is a cloth maker, also represent the urbanization process. They were not directly governed by anyone, and in time they became the mercantile middle class. It is also significant that the haberdasher, the carpenter, the weaver, and the dyer are presented collectively as being members of one of the great parish guilds. It was through these guilds association that the new urban artisans achieved the power that they lacked through their not belonging to the land hierarchy. The third group represents the church, which was in those days one of the most powerful forces in society. Eight of Chaucer's pilgrims belonged to the church, and it would be difficult to exaggerate the importance of the Roman Catholic Church to the people in the 14th century. People might complain of the malpractices and abuses that prevailed in the church, but from birth till death, people were intimately connected with the church in one way or another. It was a visibly potent force throughout England, from the great cathedrals and the religious houses down to the humble parish churches. It is sometimes suggested that the medieval world has a happier, simpler, and less troubled time than our own. In some ways, this is true. Certainly, Chaucer's pilgrims are free from many of our modern anxieties, yet the 14th century had its own troubles. The plague or Black Death, to which Chaucer occasionally alludes in the prologue, entered England in mid-century with dreadful consequences. One of the effects of the plague was to inflate prices and make conditions of life more difficult for those at the bottom of the economic ladder. This in turn led to what is known as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which the enraged mobs of peasants slaughtered many country people. Chaucer, as a justice of the peace and a member of parliament, couldn't have been bitter about this attack on the social order. It is evidence of his large-heartedness that only a few years after the rebellion he drew a portrait of the plowman, representing him as a combination of many peasant virtues. The Hundred Years' War continued with the French threatening to invade England. This is one of the reasons for the warlike nature of the shipman, whose merchant ship was armed as a fighting vessel. It and it also accounts for the merchant's anxiety about trade if the ship route between Middelburg in the Netherlands and Orwell in England were disturbed or blocked. Chaucer found a diversity of creatures in the world about him, his own world, the world of England. There lay the right raw material for all his special gifts. In all English literature, there is not such another picture of a whole society as in the prologue, and Chaucer contrived it in some 30 characters and 860 lines. In the prologue, Chaucer's sense of actuality mingled with the sense of hierarchy. He presented the characters in a jumble and haphazardly of life, with a mild apology for his neglect of rank, although all the ranks and vocations, the trades and the professions are there. The historian can reveal but of the prologue the twin ladders of church and state as they then were, with scarcely a rung missing. Not only are both the secular and ecclesiastical sides of life in the 14th century fully portrayed, but both sexes are represented. Women are adequately represented by the prioress and ecclesiastical figure, and the wife of Bath, a secular character. Furthermore, Chaucer shows us what was good and what was evil in the ecclesiastical as well as in the secular world. The knight, the squire, the yeoman, and the plowman are good characters of the secular world, while the clerk of Oxenford and the parson represent the commendable and creditable elements in the religious field. Devils that prevailed in the church have fully been dwelt upon. The monk is, for instance, averse to study and manual labor. Hunting is his favorite pastime, and fine living his aim. His worldliness and irreligious activities have been exposed without mercy. The friar sells absolution and is fond of keeping mistresses. The summoner is most corrupt. He teaches people not to feel afraid of excommunication because they can get release from the archdeacon's curse by paying money. He is the most impious man. The pardoner is a perfect fraud who makes money by the sale of the bogus relics. Even the prioress, who is free from many serious evils, has her vanities and affections which are completely out of tune with the kind of life she has embraced. Among the secular characters, the merchant makes money by illegal transactions in foreign exchange, and by usually the lawyer has acquired wealth by all sorts of unfair means, and he pretends to be busier than he actually is. The Franklin is interested only in exquisite foods and drinks. The guildsmen and their wives are shallow minded persons with their eyes on worldly advancement. Or doctor of medicine has had money during the plague and especially love gold. Like many doctors of today, he is in league with chemists. The miller is a cheat and a loose talker. The manciple can outwit the 50 law students whom he serves. The reeve is a double dealer who has accumulated wealth by throwing dust into the eyes of his employer. Of contemporary crafts, trades, and professions being so variously represented, we gain much valuable detail. Chaucer's choice of pilgrims takes us into medieval towns as well as country places. Only the royal court and the higher nobility are not represented, as they would not have joined the common pilgrimage. The glimpses we have of the tabard and reveal what would even today be quite a large hotel, capable of accommodating a large number of visitors, providing for them ample food and drink, and finding stabling for their horses. The master of such a place was indeed fit to have been a marshal in a dining hall. Sometimes the picaresque similes which Chaucer uses to elaborate a point reveal glimpses of 14th century life, to also show how much closer town and country were at that time. Moreover, details of country pursuits like forestry or farming show that Chaucer himself was as much at home in the country as among the trades and professions of the town. An incidental reference to the table dormant, which always stood ready in the Franklin's house, emphasizes the gentleman's love of food and hospitality by stressing that his table was permanently fixed in his hall. As has been made amply clear, the characters are chosen from all ranks of English society. They are delineated in the prologue by a combination of typical traits and vivid individual details, recalling the method of portrait painters in the later Middle Ages. Chaucer first presents his pilgrim against a background of rank and profession, which remarks about their position in these. Then he proceeds to give the detail, making each figure unforgettably distinct from all others of his class. The prologue tells us a lot about the food, the hobbies, and the mode of dress of the times. There is a reference to roast swan, which was one of the delicacies of the table. The monk is especially fond of this item of food. The Franklin keeps fatted partridges in basket, and he rears fish in a pond. He also keeps sharp and pungent sauces ready for service. The cook is fond of London ale. He can boil the chickens with the marrow bones, can roast and broil and fry and make a stew and bake a pie. He's an expert in preparing black manga. The summoner loves garlic and onions and drinks strong wine red as blood. Through the prologue, we become acquainted with the clothes worn by persons of different ranks, position, and profession. Shakespeare, a couple of centuries later, said, "Apparel oft proclaimeth the man." Chaucer's pilgrims wear the distinctive clothes of the class of society to which they belong or the vocation which they pursue. The knight wears his coat of mail, having lately returned from a campaign. The squire wears a short gown with long and wide sleeves. The yeoman wears an arm guard and carries a sword and a buckler on one side and a dagger on the other, with a silver medal of Saint Christopher on his breast. The bride's wimple is neatly pleated and she carries a rosary. The monk's sleeves are trimmed with the finest grey fur, and he has a pin of wrought gold to fasten his hood. The friar wears a half cape of double worsted. The merchant is dressed in motley and has a Flemish beaver hat on his head. The lawyer wears a motley coat belted with a girdle of silk with small stripes. The franklin has a dagger and a silk pouch hanging at his girdle. The five guildsmen wear new clothes and carry knives mounted not with brass but with silver. They also have their girdles and their pouches. Reference is made to the mantles of their wives. The shipman has a dagger hanging on a cord which he wears round his neck. The physician is clad in blood red and blue grey lined with taffeta and fine silk. The wife of Bath has on her head kerchiefs weighing 10 pounds, her stockings of scarlet red, and her shoes all are soft and new. The miller wears a white coat and a blue hood, and he carries a sword and a buckler by his side. The reeve has his hair clipped short in front like that of a priest. He wears a long upper coat of Persian blue and bears at his side a rusty blade. He is girdled up like a friar. The brief descriptions of the clothes of the pilgrims are quite illuminating and provide sufficient information regarding the dressing habits of the people of those times. Finally, may be pointed out that Chaucer gives us a clear idea of the commercialism and the mercenary mentality of the 14th century. Barring a few of the characters, the knight, the squire, the clerk of Oxenford, the parson, the plowman, etc., the pilgrims love money and gold. Their love of uh, pelf is common to most of the pilgrims. Their lives are governed by their desire to accumulate wealth. Strange to say, even ecclesiastical characters are not free from their materialistic greed. Not even the friar and the monk, who were supposed to live a life of poverty. A medieval pilgrimage brought people of all ranks together in a combination of pity and holiday making. The moving frame or the cinematograph employed by Chaucer enables him to show us a cross section almost complete of English life in the 14th century. All classes have representative here except the highest and the lowest, and Chaucer takes pleasure in delineating them all. The realistic quality of the prologue is indeed most striking. Chaucer here improves upon the literary tradition of his time. He does not confine himself to the poetry of dreams and visions or allegorical poetry or fanciful stuff. He becomes a painter of life as he sees it. And the life he sees is doubtless full of variety and full of a beauty of its own. But the prologue is more than a cross section of English life in the 14th century. These characters belong no doubt to that period, but they are also of all time. Their trivial are universal, their lineaments, as Blake said, are of universal human life beyond which nature never steps. They are all with us today. True, some of them have changed their names. The knight now commands a regiment, the squire is in the guards, the shipman was a rummaner while prohibition lasted and is active now in the black market. The friar is a jolly supporting publican, the partner vends quack medicines or holds cynics, and the prioress is head mistress of a fashionable girls' school. Some of them have reappeared in later literature. The poor parson was reincarnated in the vicar of Wakefield, the knight in Colonel Newcome, and the monk in Archdeacon Grantley. In addition to this universality of the characters, there is something else in the prologue that deserves attention, and this is the treatment of the subject. The prologue is rich in humor. Most of the portraits are satirical. Chaucer employs irony as his chief weapon in exposing the absurdities and the vices of his characters. However, Chaucer is neither cynical nor spiteful nor scurrilous in his satire. This stylistic device, namely The device of irony as the chief ingredient in characterization is a notable treatment of a subject and is the dramatic and narrative potential that we find in the prologue. We have there we have here the germ of many dramatic situations, while the idea of storytelling suggested by the host holds promise of great narrative possibilities, a promise amply fulfilled by the Canterbury Tales. The colloquial or conversational style of many of the lines in the prologue is noteworthy too. चलिए अब थर्ड क्वेश्चन डिस्कस करते हैं चौसर हैज नन ऑफ दैट स्ट्रॉन्ग एथिकल bias which is usually to be found in the English mind, or he is not horrified by the behavior of his fellow beings and he has no desire to reform them. Consider this opinion with reference to the prologue. Or do you gather from the prologue that Chaucer was a social reformer? Chaucer's poetry mirrors but does not on the whole criticize the society in which he lived. He was interested more in knowing than in improving men and women. He was concerned with the permanent features of the human comedy, not the distortions wrought on human nature by the shortcomings of social organization. This is the comment of a critic on Chaucer's work. Chaucer is generally regarded as a painter of life in his age, but not as a social reformer. A good deal has been written about the social life of the second half of the 14th century in England, its ecclesiastical troubles, its dynastic and military feuds, the evil consequences of the Black Death, the peasants' revolt, the growing strength and influence of the trading classes. But all these things make their appearance on the fringe of Chaucer's poetry. They are referred to in passing. There are numerous topical references to events of the day, but they remain marginal. Chaucer is said to have known Wycliffe, but he did not directly and explicitly attack the evils of the church as the author of Piers Plowman. Rightly does another critic say there's nothing of the dreamer about Chaucer, nothing of the stern moralist and social reformer. Like Shakespeare, he makes it his business in the Canterbury Tales to paint life as he sees it. The wealth and variety of the tales give us, as in a camera obscura, not merely a faithful picture of different sides of medieval life in England, but a vitalized epitome of all that is interesting in medieval literature. To quote yet another critic, Chaucer was certainly aware of the religious corruptions of the time, and the satirical portraits of unworthy churchmen show his sympathy with some of Wycliffe's ideas, but on the whole, he did not touch the burning question of the period. There was nothing of the reformer in his nature. Although a student of the classics, he lived wholly in the present, studied the men and women of his own time, and portrayed them as they were, adding always a touch of humor or romance to make them more interesting. The Canterbury Tales he finally broke with allegory and painted in immortal colors actually contemporary life and human nature. When the principle of the direct imitation of nature was recognized, it was rapidly developed in other European countries by Aristo, by Cavendish, by Molière, but to Chaucer must be assigned the honor of having led the way. Chaucer takes men as he finds them, obtaining that kind of amusement and the ironic yet sympathetic observation of his fellows, which yields itself only to the artist's vision. The prologue clearly shows that Chaucer is interested only in portraying characters as they are. He does not anywhere urge people to improve themselves morally or in any other way. He does not show the writer's indignation of a social reformer. In fact, a reading of the prologue makes us feel that there was nothing in the 14th century to feel indignant about, and yet Chaucer exposes the absurdities and evils of his times through his portrayal of various characters. He unmasks both the secular and the ecclesiastical evils of his times, but he does so without moralizing. Taking some of the ecclesiastical characters first, we find that Chaucer uses the technique of irony to reveal their vices. The prioress is charitable and pitiful, but she shows her charity and pity in her treatment of her pet dogs and not of her fellow human beings. The prioress is charitable and pitiful, but she knows her charity and pity in her treatment of her pet dogs and not of her fellow human beings. In other words, it is a misdirected kind of charity and pity. Similarly, her fashionable manners and her learning the French language shows that she is concerned more with worldly accomplishments than with things of the spirit. Even the inscription of the brooch that she wears is ambiguous in its connotation. Likewise, the monk is ironically called a fair prelate. This monk loves haunting and does not observe the rules of monastic discipline. He wears a pin of wrought gold with a love knot, but Chaucer nowhere expresses his irritation with this man and does not emphasize in explicit terms his disapproval. He adopts the same attitude towards the friar. The friar grants absolution for money. He carries knives and pins to give to fair women. He is averse to meeting the poor people. He makes money by settling disputes on love days and so on. But Chaucer does not show any reformist zeal in portraying him. Chaucer's freedom from malice towards his fellows is nowhere more plainly shown than in his description and characterization of the summoner. This pimpled, scraggy, bearded, lecherous, drunken wretch, this foul-breathing, ignorant swindler, whose hideous aspect terrified children, but who not yet had jurisdiction over all young people in the diocese, still does not tempt the poet to moralize. In fewer than 50 lines, Chaucer exposes him body and soul as mercilessly as Swift or Aldous Huxley might have done in a far larger space of prose. Unlike these later satirists, however, Chaucer does not consume himself in a frenzy of hatred and disgust. Nevertheless, his satire bites as powerfully as theirs. The partner turns out to be the fitting companion for the summoner, and so they join in song. The song which the partner sings is a popular love ditty. The partner carries a bag full of pardons or indulgences from which he makes money. He also makes money by selling bogus relics. He has a pillowcase, a small piece of a sail, and pigs, bones which he will palm off on credulous people. Chaucer ironically calls him a noble ecclesiastic. Thus, the malpractices and abuses of the church are mercilessly exposed by Chaucer. Through his portrayal of these characters, Chaucer does not mince matters. He unveils the reality beneath the surface, and yet he does not offer any suggestions to remedy the undesirable state of affairs in the church and does not spell out any measures for reform. He is content with recording his observations through his attitude of disapproval is made perfectly clear. In describing the secular characters, Chaucer uses the same weapon of irony but does not anywhere indulge in denunciation, condemnation, or censure which a social reformer would employ. In other words, here too we have a detached, ironic portrayal of life. Chaucer acknowledges the lawyer's ability but exposes the fraudulent nature of his transactions in respect of land. He emphasizes the lawyer's cunning. If the lawyer is rich, it is because of his sharp legal practices, and of course, he seemed busier than he was. The Franklin is depicted as being interested only in food and drink. He is Epicurus' own son, and he is the Saint Julian of his country, with a table dormant in his hall. This is obviously good humored criticism, not angry condemnation. The physician has his apothecaries to send him drugs and medicines, and they all make profits with one another's convenience. The physician has made money during the pestilence and loves gold, especially for gold and medicine is a cordial. The irony in the portrayal of the physician is quite transparent. It is an amusing portrayal, but it is prompted by no ill will or spite, nor does it give any hint of any intention on Chaucer's part to bring about a reform in the medical profession. The wife of Bath is a famous character in the prologue. Chaucer could have condemned her for her loose living in her youth, but he simply says, with reference to this fact in her life, but there's no need to discuss that now. He is not the least harsh towards her for her amorousness and for her expert knowledge of the remedies of love. The miller's dishonesty in stealing his customers' flour and charging them 3 times his fee is clearly indicated. The miller has a thumb of gold, but in the description of the miller, Chaucer's attitude is one of extremely leniency, which would never be the case with the social reformer. The municipal can outwit all the 50 law students under whom he serves, but Chaucer merely states this fact without any comment on it. The Reeve is another dishonest character. He can maintain his accounts in such a way that no auditor can find fault with him, but he has accumulated private wealth and he had been hoodwinking his lord by lending him the lord's own goods and receiving not only the lord's thanks but also a coat and a hood as a reward. This is very funny indeed, but Chaucer enjoys the fun and wants us to enjoy it also. The frauds of the Riv do not infuriate Chaucer. In short, Chaucer's treatment of the characters in the prologue is genial, even makes some of them amiable in spite of their affections and vices. Although any explicitly motive or social reform was far from Chaucer's thoughts, the moral implications of its characterization in the prologue should not be completely brushed aside. Even every ironic or satirist is at bottom or moralist. Also, the desire to reform people is implied in the act of exposing their weaknesses, follies, and vices. From this point of view, the difference between satire and pure humor must be clearly understood. Humor, when it's pure, aims at laughter for the fun of it. Satire too produces laughter, but it aims at reform. Though the same in the case of writers like Chaucer is not forcefully or aggressively or brutally asserted. Chaucer is not professedly a social reformer, but his irony and satire could not have left the wicked, the villainous, and the evil people totally unmoved. His satire must have gone home and must have caused some heart searching. थैंक यू। आई होप आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है। कैसी लगी हमें कमेंट करके बताएं और अगर कोई डाउट्स या सजेशंस हैं तो वो भी आप कमेंट सेक्शन में हमसे पूछ सकते हैं। मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे। टिल देन कीप वॉचिंग एंड कीप सपोर्टिंग द सोलफुल डायरी। थैंक यू।